Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to all our wonderful viewers for Shmoozing with Avi, another episode with people that I am so impressed by. And today, I'm very excited to introduce you to a gentleman that I've never met before, but I've always been very fascinated by the work that he's done, and he's worked with people that I've known for many, many, many years. And so, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to meet David Armstrong. David Armstrong is the host and producer of David Armstrong's Broadway Nation, a podcast which is part of the Broadway Podcast Network. He was the executive producer and artistic director of the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, and he directed on Broadway in 2012 in the musical Scandalous. His work has been seen in New York, Los Angeles, regional theaters all over the country. I'm not going to tell them all, but the Kennedy Center, which I also worked in a very long time ago, the Ford's Theater, and New Jersey's Paper Mill Playhouse, one of the greatest regional theaters in the country. And he's written books for the musicals The Wonder Years, which won 7 Dramalogue Awards, Gold Rush, and Yankee Doodle Dandy. He is in the 3rd year of teaching a course, and this is one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by his work. It's called The Broadway Musical: How Immigrants, Jews, Queers, and African Americans Invented America's Signature Art Form. He teaches at the University of Washington School of Drama. He has worked with some of my best friends, the greatest Yiddish and Jewish performers in the world, Theo Bakel, Bruce Adler, and Judy Kay. He's worked with Zalman Malotic at the Volksbühne Theater, and the most amazing thing is he's not even Jewish. So I'd like to invite to join me, David Armstrong. Please join our Zoom and let's schmooze.
Hello, hello.
Hello, and there you are.
And I work with your wife.
And you worked with my wife, Laura Turnbull, and our dear friends, Carol and Roy Fantel, which is actually how I met Laura. Or Laura knew Carol from when she worked with you on Nonsense. So it's a small, small world, and Jewish geography is even smaller.
Absolutely.
David, looking at all your materials and all your podcasts and all the amazing material that you do, I am incredibly intrigued by the fact that you're not Jewish and yet you have found this amazing niche. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, how you grew up, and how did you discover this Jewish connection to what you do?
Sure. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was raised Catholic, actually. And there's this strong connection, you go back to the roots of the American musical, and it's all Irish and German Catholics and Jews that are coming together because they couldn't get any other jobs, basically. There was no other opportunities open to them. We forget how, discriminated against not just the Jews were, but also the Catholics of that era, of the turn of the century. It was people were very suspicious of them, and especially Irish Catholics just could not get any work. So in a way, show business was the only thing that was open to these immigrant groups that had come to the country during that period. They couldn't get any other work, so they took over show business. Basically, they invented show business. But I come quite a bit later than that. I grew up in the 60s in Cincinnati. I fell in love with Cincinnati is a great arts town and has a lot of, so many of those cities that were frankly settled by German Jews and Germans in general back at the turn of the century and even before, because back in the 1870s, 60s, and 70s, German immigrants, many of them Jewish, spread across the country and settled in Cincinnati and St. Louis and all those Midwestern towns. And they brought fun to America, in a way. I often say they brought beer gardens and they brought arts and culture. And, Cincinnati has one of the oldest opera companies and music festivals in the country. And so many of those cities do, because that's what the Germans, many of them Jews, brought to America with them. We probably have the arts in this country because of that, because the Puritan stock was not really interested in that, as we know. So anyway, I grew up in Cincinnati, surrounded by a lot of arts and culture, a family that was not in show business in any way, shape, or form, but was, enjoyed the arts. I mostly fell in love with musical theater through movies that I saw either on television or going to movies as a kid. I didn't see, and then eventually, and a lot of the touring shows would come to Cincinnati, and I started going to those even when I was a kid, and especially when I was a teenager. But I was one of those weird kids that knew from the very beginning what I wanted to do. I would organize the whole neighborhood into doing a show that I would, not knowing what these things were, but now I know that I would write and direct and choreograph and star in these shows with everybody. And so basically I've done what I did for my career professionally, I started doing when I was 9 years old, to a great extent.
Do you remember a specific moment where the word Jewish kind of became part of your knowledge base? Like, how did that happen?
It's interesting. Hebrew Union College was just down the street from where I lived in Cincinnati. I lived in a neighborhood. Our next door neighbors were Jewish, so I was aware of, and also this was also, you have to remember, this is the 1960s. The Catholic Church was a very different thing than it was today. It was the whole the ecumenical idea of it, and we got taken to a Jewish synagogue when I was a kid in grade school.
Wow.
I remember that very vividly. There was a big Jewish synagogue downtown Cincinnati that we went on a field trip to.
Wow.
It was part of that whole era of, Vatican II, and everything was much more open and much more liberal than...
Right. Finally, we were not guilty of killing Jesus anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. You got reprieved from that. Yeah.
No,
but yeah, that was the time. That was that period. So that's the world I grew up in.
Right.
But, you ask about how did I get... If you love musical theater and you grow up musical theater and listening to these voices, I mean, I played every cast album that you can imagine that was in my parents' record cabinet, and then the ones I would bring in as I started to become aware of it. And so many of those creators were Jewish, and the rhythms of Jewish humor and speaking and thought and ideas are just infused into these shows. So I always say everybody who works in the theater is an honorary Jew of some kind or another. Right. You can't be in the business without being, absorbing it. Osmosis. I'm Jewish by osmosis, I guess.
And it's not just theater. I mean, I taught a course at the University of Miami called Yiddish, the Foundation of Modern Culture.
Sure.
And basically my hypothesis is not unlike yours. But it goes beyond theater, because Hollywood was created by Yiddish-speaking immigrants who came and went out west and started the movie industry. Comedy was really started by all these Yiddish vaudevillians who were doing these stand-up routines. And the list goes on and on.
The music industry, Tin Pan Alley, right. All of popular music, really, all of American entertainment is heavily, if not primarily, influenced by Jewish artists, Jewish people.
Not to mention, even bagels becoming part of mainstream culture, the legal profession, and the list goes on and on. So when did you really start taking seriously this concept that you could do the research? I mean, obviously you've been in the business for a long time. So maybe you want to share with our audience a little bit about your professional life, but I'm really fascinated by the academic element And when you started putting together the pieces of this concept of these different factions creating what we now know as the Broadway musical.
That came relatively late, although as I look back, I was assembling all these pieces all along the way. As I said, I grew up in Cincinnati. I started doing theater at a very young age, not professionally, but I was a kid. I studied creative dramatics. I went to dancing school. I did shows constantly as a child, which I think is one of the greatest educations you can have. I would say everything I know about history I learned from Broadway musicals, and that's a lot about history, actually. Then I went to the University of Cincinnati to the College Conservatory of Music program there and the theater program both. And then I moved to New York I started directing and choreographing very early when I was quite young, and was very lucky to fall in with a very accomplished director who had a terrific career, and I started being his choreographer. So I ended up working at almost so many of the great regional theaters across the country when I was still in my early 20s. And then when he was not, because I would go there and the shows would be successful and we would have a great time, and the theater, the people, the artistic directors would get to know me. When Jack Going is the gentleman's name, a terrific director, when he was not available, then they started hiring me to direct shows. So I'm directing shows at amazing theaters when I'm still in my late 20s. And that just led to a career, to now a 40-year career as in the business. I was the artistic director of the Cahoes Music Hall, which is where I met Laura and Carol, and where Carol met Roy. That for a few years, I did that in upstate New York, and then the big job of my life was in 2000. I came to Seattle to become the producing artistic director of the Fifth Avenue Theater, and did that for 18 years. I just stepped down just 3 years ago. And it was a phenomenal opportunity. It's a very large theater company. We had 20,000 plus subscribers throughout the whole time I was there, and they still do. And we were able to not only do big productions because of the scale of the theater and the scale of the audience, we also developed a lot of shows. So we did 19 new musicals during my time at the Fifth Avenue, including 9 that went to Broadway. So that was really just look, I'll never have another job like that was that fantastic. But it was also, I knew it was time to step away from that. And as I was looking for other opportunities, I was approached by the University of Washington, the School of Drama there, about teaching. And I thought, sure. And they wanted me to teach a history of the American musical course. And that's when I started thinking, well, what would I teach? What is my idea? And I also had this idea of a podcast we're sort of coming together at the same time. And basically the course at the UW inspired the podcast and vice versa. They sort of came together and have working off of one another. And that's where I started thinking, well, what is the history of the American musical theater? What have I learned about it over this time? And that's where these ideas really started to coalesce of, this is a creation of marginalized groups. We don't think of it that way because it's become so successful and so big and so, pervasive in our culture. But if you go back to this invention of the musical starting, I basically started at the turn of the century, right at 1900 is where the musical, there's some things that happened before that, but it really what we would call a musical, though if you identify and you sort of trace it from, how that influenced the show after that and that show after that, it really comes from this period around in the 1900 and through to that first decade of the century, where all these immigrant groups are, and the story of the musical wouldn't exist if it wasn't for an open immigration policy. That is why we have musical theater. It's why we have the movies, probably, at least the way we have them, is because there was open door immigration at that time for a number of reasons, because we needed America needed the labor, so all those people streaming into the country at that time, especially into New York City, it's sort of like and at the same time, all of these African Americans moving in what's called the Great Migration, coming to New York at that same period. Everything intersects, and because they're all marginalized and they really can't get a lot of other work in any sort of acceptable, reputable kind of business, they have to go into the disreputable business of show business, which no respectable person will do or take. And it's true because we know that for centuries people have thought of show people as being just one step away from vagabonds and prostitutes.
Right. So it's fascinating because one of the things I was teaching as well. So the first major wave of Jewish immigration to the United States was in the 1880s, and many of those immigrants that were coming over were bringing with them the musicals. The first Yiddish theater piece ever produced was actually in Romania, in Yas, Romania, it was a musical by Abraham Goldfaden called The Sorceress. And he brought that to America in the 1880s. And so suddenly here in New York in the 1880s, there were these little Yiddish theaters that were popping up, and they were doing Shakespeare in Yiddish, and they were doing musicals in Yiddish, and they were developing all these actors that were performing in Yiddish. I remember having a great conversation with the president of Actors Equity Association, and they were promoting themselves as the first actors union in the United States of America. And I talked to the president at the time, and I said, listen, I hate to blow your bubble, but the first acting union in America was the Hebrew Actors Union. And it wasn't until much later that the Actors Equity Association was built, out of many of the actors who came out of the Hebrew Actors Union.
Right.
So tell us about...
What I think is so interesting about what you just said, though, is that 1880, so basically 20 years later, that influences, and think about the young people who went to see those Yiddish theater shows growing up and becoming, the creators of the American musical.
Right, and the audiences.
And the audience.
And their children became the audiences because the Yiddish theater was famous for people bringing their entire family and their lunch and their dinner, and they would come to the theater and sit and just spend the day eating and drinking and talking back to the stage and having a very interactive, and they brought their children. And the children grew up seeing the theater, listening to the songs, and they started going to Broadway, and then their children and their children. And here we are, 3, 4, 5 generations later, talking about Broadway as one of the greatest American iconic experiences, but really you're right. It comes from that, multi-ethnic mix of immigrants and races and genders. The homosexual community is one of the most important communities in the creation of the American cultural scene. Tell us about your podcast, and at the same time, I guess, tell us about how your podcast and your course at the University of Washington, kind of evolved, because your podcast is amazing. I went to the, and tell everybody how they can find it. I went to look at the Broadway network, and I was, really blown away at how many podcasts you've done talking on this subject. So can you tell us more about all that?
Sure, absolutely. I just released the 38th episode, actually, and that's the third episode of season 2. So I've had a pretty big break over the past almost 6 months between season 1 and season 2. And a lot of that was just getting ready to launch season 2. So the idea of the podcast is very similar to the description of the course that you read before. I always say it is the podcast that tells the remarkable story of how immigrants, Jews, queers, and African Americans invented the Broadway musical and how they changed America in the process. And it very much, and I actually use some of the podcast episodes in my course so that I can then spend the lecture period showing clips and going deeper into the things that I talk about in the podcast. Not every podcast is of each episode is used in the course, and I go much deeper and more academically into some things in the course than I do on a podcast for the general public. But they're very closely related.
Did you start the podcast at the same time? Like, what was the order of what did you start first? The course?
I did the course the first year, and then when we got to COVID, the second year I did it, I was going to have to teach it not virtually but remotely. Right. And I thought, well, this is what I need to do. I'd been thinking about the podcast anyway, so I started recording episodes so that I could use them because I wasn't going to be able to teach in person. So it really I was going to do it anyway, but COVID really sort of made it clear that I had to do that.
Right.
And then I launched the podcast right in the middle of that quarter that I was teaching. So that was spring quarter 2 years ago now. And then I've continued using the podcast as I teach the course as part of it. And now I'm very happy to say that I keep hearing from people, my podcasts are being used in university courses and some high school courses, actually all across the country now, at least in part.
Wow.
So that's been really exciting to see that roll out.
I'm going to end up asking you to do me a favor.
Sure.
Because I think, I don't know if you know, but I do a lot of work revolving around Joe Papp. And Joe Papp, really was probably the most important producer, perhaps of both the 20th and the 21st centuries, because of his influence. And, he was born a Yiddish-speaking boy from Brooklyn named Yossel Papirofsky. And so I've been working on a lot of Joe Papp material, and it was just his 100th birth centennial. Have you done, or would you consider doing a podcast specifically on Joe?
I would love to do it. Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, especially in its, my singular focus is on musicals, but he has so much impact on the musical theater. Exactly. Hair, Chorus Line, Pirates of Penzance.
Oh, yes. The list goes on and on.
So absolutely, he ties right in. And
Hamilton
exactly
was developed at the Public Theater.
Yeah.
So he created the model of the workshop.
He and Michael Bennett invented something that had never been done before.
That's right. So I think it's time for Joe to get his due.
I think that's a perfect podcast subject matter. We will work on this together.
I hope so. I look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So COVID, as horrible as it has been, for us as well, has been kind of a blessing in disguise, because it forced us all to expand the way we think of what we do and how we can approach an audience. Your podcasts are probably reaching hundreds of thousands of people all over the world.
Literally 38 countries I have listeners in now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable.
Yeah, we've experienced the same, because we were forced into an all virtual life. And so we were doing festivals in person, live venue festivals before COVID. And now we've gone to full virtual 7-day festivals with, dozens of events, hundreds of performers, and viewers from all over the world, hundreds of thousands of them. And it's fascinating to see how the world of Jewish and Yiddish specifically Yiddish language, has it really moved into a renaissance, unlike anything I've experienced in all my years. And I've been doing this, like you, a very long time. I actually started professionally at the age of 10 in the Yiddish theater in New York. So I've been around for a while. But that brings me to my next question. So you worked with two of the greatest Yiddish theater performers, Theo Bakel and Bruce Adler. Aleim Hasholem, their memories should be blessed. Bruce especially was a very dear friend of mine who I worked with on many shows. And Theo was a very close friend. Now, you also worked with Judy Kay, who, thankfully is still around, still creating, and
Still
doing
going to be on
amazing
Broadway this year.
That's right.
Just
That's right. So, and Zalman, of course, who amazingly enough was my musical director when I was 8 years old and I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof at the community center in the Bronx. He was playing the piano. So, can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because I'm
yes.
fascinated by that, and maybe it's time for a revival. So, tell us.
It was one of the best shows I have ever done, I have to say, that nobody knows about. And certainly a lot of people saw it because we went to all the big venues in Florida that season. I'm trying to remember what year this was. I'm terrible with dates. But we played the
What was it called?
It had a terrible title, I have to say. It was called Greetings from Sholem. No, Greetings from. It was originally supposed to be called Greetings from Tevye, Sholem Aleichem Lives. But then Theo got nervous about using Tevye in the title because he wasn't really going to play Tevye in it. So then it ended up just being called Greetings from Sholem Aleichem, I believe. We went through several different titles.
Huh.
What it was, however, though, it was just the three performers. It was Judy and Theo and Bruce.
Oh my
performing,
God.
Performing these really fantastic little sketches that were little playlets that were taken from stories by Sholem Aleichem that had nothing to do with Fiddler. So the one thing was, we're going to do stories that have nothing to do with Fiddler on the Roof or with the Fiddler stories. And there's so many, of course. They're fantastic. And so they would have been adapted into these basically like little one acts, very short. Some of them were 10 minutes long, some were like 20 minutes long, some were 5 minutes long. They were very quick, almost like review sketches in a way, but with heart and depth. And of course, they were very funny, but also very touching at times. Ooh. And then in and around that was woven all this music, some of it from Bruce's repertoire and a lot of it from Theo's repertoire, but basically all coming from the world of Yiddish theater and Sholem Aleichem in a way. So, and my job as sort of the resident goy was we adapted, and I got to participate in this, which was really fun. We translated a lot of the Yiddish lyrics into English so that it could play to a broad audience. But very often, I'm sure you've done this yourself, you'd take a song and the first line would be in Yiddish and then the second line would be the same words in English. And then so you end up, and you go back and forth. So basically you end up with everybody understanding the song. Right. And that was great fun to do. And my job was sort of to say, okay, I think we got too much Yiddish here. I need a little more. You got to help me out here because I don't know what's going on. And that was a great sort of, and to work with and Theo and Bruce primarily did the translations, which was really fun. Alan Nee was the playwright who had done the adaptations.
Oh, sure.
You know, Alan, of course. Yeah, he did the adaptation of the stories, and his work in that show is phenomenal and absolutely should have a life. And I think you could take that same concept and, depending on the performers, find the music that goes with it.
Of course.
And Zalman, we had this fantastic band, fantastic klezmer band that accompanied it. And it was, the music was just sensational. But of course, we had three of the great musical performers of all time in the show.
Right. And this show exists.
The pieces must exist. I have a script for it somewhere. It doesn't exist as something that anybody has currently licensed, or it doesn't exist at the moment, but it could probably be assembled. You'd have to talk to Alan and acquire the pieces.
I was going to say, so if we wanted to recreate this piece, maybe find a better name for it.
Please.
You know, yes, because I love the Sholem Aleichem stories, especially
so
the Nachum Mendel. He's got all these wonderful characters and just such a wonderful sense of humor and a sense of a world that really doesn't exist anymore. It exists in theater, it exists in music, but the world itself, unfortunately, you know, was destroyed. And has evolved since. I would be so excited to work with you on bringing that piece back.
Well, let's get Zalman on the phone and we'll, yeah.
Interesting enough, I was talking to Zalman just a couple of weeks ago before the holidays, and he and I were talking about finding projects we can do together again. So
he approached me about 10 years ago now saying, well, should we try to revive this? And then you know how things go. We didn't, neither one of us followed up on it.
Right.
And I actually think Theo was still alive and remember, it may have been longer than that because I'm pretty sure Theo and Bruce were both still alive at that point.
That was longer than that,
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's a project for us to work on together.
All right.
There you go.
It's a date.
So tell us a little bit about where you see yourself moving forward, not only hopefully in the soon-to-be post-COVID era, but you know, what are your future plans for your teaching, for your podcast, and beyond? Are you still directing?
I'm not currently directing, but then nobody's really currently.
I was going to say there's not much.
So I certainly don't feel that my directing career is over, but in a way, everything sort of worked out in a very good way that without knowing it. Stepping down at the time I did got me moving on these other projects with teaching and with the podcast, not knowing that it was going to come a time when there were not going to be any opportunity to direct or produce or really do anything. And writing as well. I'm also a playwright. So I want to pursue writing, especially. Of course, I want to continue directing, but the podcast has really taken off, and especially this new season really has started to break out a little bit in terms of, we look at this, you know, it's so weird. Podcasting is such a strange thing, but I'm happy to say that I just in the past couple of weeks have risen up the charts of the top history podcast. So I'm now number 137 on the top history podcast charts, which may not sound so great, but there's 2 million podcasts in the world.
Wow.
So it's actually, and there's only, you know, the chart only does the top 200. So I'm thrilled about that. I'm just thrilled about the response of it. I also wanted, and have started to do this here locally, again, before, right, there was a little blip where there was live performance happening, do sort of live versions of the podcast in a way, sort of Broadway Nation live events. With video and with live singers, ideally.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what I've done in the past with video, with you know, multi-image images behind me, as well as live performers.
I mean, you say podcast is weird, but to me, it used to have a different name.
Radio.
Right.
Totally. The golden age of radio. We're in the second golden age of radio, basically.
Right. I mean, it's just another form. Can you tell us about how people can hear and sign up to listen to your podcast?
Absolutely. Again, it's called Broadway Nation. It's available, if you already listen to podcasts, it's available on every single podcast platform. Wherever you get podcasts, Broadway Nation is available. You also can go online to the Broadway Podcast Network, to their website, or they have an app, and find it there. But you can also find it on Stitcher, on all the things. I know it's so interesting. My generation of people, the baby boomers, are sometimes either they totally know what a podcast is and they're into it, or they're like, I don't really know what that is, I don't know where to find it.
Right.
And it's like, you know, and I would say, and this works for 99% of people. Do you have an iPhone? They go, yes, I do. Well, on your iPhone, there's a little purple app that's already built into it, and you just press that app, and then you type in Broadway Nation, and you will go immediately to it. And you will then fall in love with podcasts.
And when they get to Broadway Nation, do they need to find you within there? Or
No,
is that
it immediately, all the episodes will just pop right up.
Right. So your podcast is called Broadway Nation.
David Armstrong's Broadway Nation, but
there you
just need Broadway Nation is
Excellent.
All you need. Yeah.
Excellent.
And yeah, so that's the easiest way. It's also, I have a website. There's a Broadway Nation website you can go to, and you can listen to it there as well.
Excellent. And are you continuing to teach?
Yes, I'm going to be teaching winter quarter. I only teach one quarter each year. So this year I'm going to be teaching winter quarter at the University of Washington. And I also teach part-time, or sort of this year, just next month, I'm going to be doing a short series, a short lecture for for New York University for their musical theater writing program. But that's on story structure. That's sort of a different aspect of what I do.
Cool. Well, I am so excited that you could join us. I am even more excited about the possibilities of our future collaborations.
Because I love networking like this.
I already see the Shalom Aleichem program. I already see some kind of a Joe Papp podcast, maybe even a whole curricula on Joe Papp and his influence on the Broadway musical and the Broadway theater and everything else, and the development of off-Broadway. I mean, in a way, he really created off-Broadway. There were always these little shows going on, but once he established that, New York Shakespeare Festival and the Public Theater on Lafayette Street, man, that's when it took off and created an entire genre of theater. And I think
but he certainly defined the nonprofit theater company in New York, but actually that was an example for the whole nonprofit theater network that grew up all around the country.
Right.
He set an example for so much of that.
Great. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for being part of our Hanukkah festival, and we have so many more programs to enjoy. And I can't wait to find more and more things and to hear more and more about the work you're doing and to see what we could do together. So thank you so much for joining me.
And give my best to your lovely wife.
I shall.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us for another episode of Shmoozing with Avi and our wonderful guest, David Armstrong. Please go find his podcast because I am so blown away by everything that he has to say, and you have so much to learn from our good friend David Armstrong. Hashem Dank, stay tuned for more wonderful programs and our continuing work and why I love Jewish.org. Thank you.